Hypothalamus. It's an important endocrine regulatory gland that emphasizes its control over the pituitary gland, and it also has a role in homeostasis. Now, hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland by means of its releasing hormones, and it also has a role in homeostasis. Homeostasis means balance in the body. So, hypothalamus maintains homeostasis by means of its connection with the autonomic nervous system, by which it regulates heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, and hypothalamus also has a role in controlling our appetite, hunger. So, this is how it maintains the balance or homeostasis in the body. Now, where is hypothalamus located? Your hypothalamus, it's about the size of an almond, and it is located just below the thalamus and above the pituitary gland. It sits directly above the brainstem at the base of your brain. Here you can see you have hypothalamus. The word hypo is derived from Latin word mean below. So hypothalamus is just below your thalamus and it sits above your pituitary gland. So this is the location of hypothalamus. Hypothalamus plays a crucial role in many important functions, which includes releasing hormones. It also maintains daily physiological cycles, for example, sleep cycles. It controls your appetite and hunger. It also controls the sexual behaviors. It also regulates your emotional behaviors. So this is just a brief overview of all the functions of hypothalamus. Remember, by means of releasing hormones, hypothalamus has its control over the pituitary gland, as we saw before. And in physiological cycles, for example, sleep cycle, hypothalamus has an important role. It also controls your emotions like anger and happiness. It has a role in controlling your sexual behaviors, and hypothalamus also has a role in controlling your autonomic functions, for example, BP, your heart rate, your body temperature. All those are also under the control of hypothalamus. Important hormones produced by hypothalamus include growth hormone releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, somatostatin, dopamine. Now the first four hormones, which are releasing hormone, are basically have positive feedback effect, mean they cause increase in release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So they control the secretion from the anterior pituitary. Whereas somatostatin and dopamine, they have negative feedback, or in other words we can say they have inhibitory effect on the anterior pituitary, where somatostatin causes negative feedback effect on the growth hormone release from the anterior pituitary, whereas dopamine has inhibitory effect on the prolactin. Then we have vasopressin and oxytocin. Now these are formed by neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, and remember, vasopressin, anti-diuretic hormone, and oxytocin, they go on to be stored into the posterior pituitary by means of nerves, whereas all other hormones, those releasing hormones and the last two, somatostatin and dopamine, those go by means of blood vessels into the anterior pituitary, whereas vasopressin and oxytocin go on to be stored onto the posterior pituitary. So this is important to be known. Now this figure shows how hypothalamus drives its control over the anterior pituitary. Now various releasing hormones, as I discussed before, will have a positive feedback effect on the anterior pituitary. These releasing hormones include gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. All these causes positive feedback, that is increase of release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Whereas the inhibitory hormone, which include dopamine and somatostatin, both of them will inhibit the secretions of hormones. Like dopamine inhibits the secretion of prolactin from the anterior pituitary, whereas somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone. Now gonadotropin releasing hormone controls the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary, and the ultimate site of these hormones is gonads, which includes testes in males and ovaries in females, whereas corticotropin releasing hormone controls the secretion of adrenocorticotropin hormone. The ultimate site of action of this hormone from anterior pituitary is adrenal cortex, which ultimately secretes the cortisol. Then we have thyrotropin releasing hormone, which controls the secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone from anterior pituitary, and the ultimate site of action is thyroid, which causes release of thyroid hormones T3 and T4. Similarly, prolactin releasing hormone have a positive effect, whereas dopamine has a negative effect, that is, it inhibits the release of prolactin, and the effect of prolactin is on the mammary glands in milk production. Then we have growth hormone releasing hormone, which will have a positive effect on the growth hormone release from anterior pituitary, whereas somatostatin has a negative effect, that is, inhibitory effect on the release from the growth hormone from anterior pituitary. Now, the growth hormone ultimately will affect the liver and other parts of the body. It increases the release of insulin-like growth factor, which has a role in growth of the body, growth of the long bones of the body. Then we said that the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, they will form anti-diuretic hormone and oxytocin, which moves by means of nerve cells into the posterior pituitary. Now, these two hormones, anti-diuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, will ultimately act on the kidneys, and it causes retention of water, whereas oxytocin also released from the posterior pituitary, which comes from the hypothalamus, and oxytocin has an effect on the mammary gland, that is milk ejection. Now remember, prolactin has a role in milk production, whereas oxytocin has a role in milk ejection. And then, as compared to the other hormones which acts on the anterior pituitary, all these hormones, these travel via blood onto the anterior pituitary. So hypothalamus releases these hormones which travels via blood to the anterior pituitary, whereas the hormones which are stored in the posterior pituitary, which comes from hypothalamus, like ADH and oxytocin, they travels via these nerve fibers. So this is an important difference. Then we should also know how the secretions of these hormones is controlled, because this occurred by a feedback loop mechanism, which means that the control of each hormone is regulated. If it's not regulated, this will result in disorders. So there has to be a limited amount of secretion of, for example, gonads, which causes release of testosterone or estrogens in case of females. So this has to be in a limited quantity or an adequate quantity, and not too much or too less, which will result in various disorders. So how this is controlled? This is controlled by feedback loop. For example, one example of feedback loop is, for example, hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary releases adrenocorticotropin hormone, which ultimately acts on the adrenal cortex, the final site, and this causes release of cortisol. Now, this always occurs in response to some stimulus to the hypothalamus. For example, stress causes release of this corticotropin releasing hormone, which has a control on anterior pituitary, and this cycles goes on to ultimately release the cortisol. Now, once cortisol is released, it will have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary to stop the further secretions of these hormones. If this is not stopped, then ultimately excess of cortisol will be produced. Therefore, this negative feedback is important. Once you have sufficient amount of cortisol to fight the stress or whatever response has stimulated hypothalamus, further secretion will be stopped by negative feedback mechanism. This control is very important. So the positive feedback mechanism increases the secretions of all these hormones in the cycle. This is also known as hypothalamic, pituitary and adrenal axis. If there is gonads as a final site, then this will be hypothalamic, pituitary, gonadal axis. But in those cases, hormones are different. In those cases, you have gonadotropin releasing hormone. So the ultimate basic concept is same, that is positive feedback loop, and how the final product has a negative feedback effect on the primary organs, which include hypothalamus and anterior pituitary in these cases. So this is how feedback loop mechanism works, and this is the basic physiology of how hypothalamus exerts its control over the other organs, and how it is also controlled by the products of the final organ.